Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon at this webinar with Professor Mike Spagat, being hosted by Every Casualty Counts. For those of you who were expecting Louisa Loveluck in this chair, unfortunately, she had some last-minute complications, which meant she was unable to join us. She sent her apologies, and we hope that we'll have her with us for another similar event in future. So my name is Rachel Taylor. I am the Executive Director at Every Casualty Counts, and I have the honor of leading that organization as well as this webinar today. Every Casualty Counts is, as far as we're aware, the only organization in the world which is exclusively focused on ensuring the documentation of every victim of war, genocide, and other forms of armed conflict. And we do this through promotion of effective and standardized casualty recording, which is the comprehensive documentation of fatalities in a situation of armed violence. Professor Mike Spagat has been not only a dear friend of Every Casualty, but also of the casualty recording field for many, many years now. In fact, some of his research, I believe, was quite instrumental to the development of this as a specific field of research. Professor Spagat is a professor of economics at the Royal Holloway University of London. He has a Ph.D. from Harvard and has previously been on the faculty at the University of Illinois and Brown's. His research as an economist specializes on universal patterns in war, and in particular on the measurement of deaths and obstacles and methods for more effective measurements of deaths in armed conflict. So he really is probably the most specialized expert in this field that we could hope to have with us today. Professor Spagat was also one of the leading authors of the Gaza Mortality Survey, which was published earlier this year in The Lancet and in the Global Health, which was done in collaboration with researchers based in Gaza, doing household surveys of mortalities during the conflict, which led to some very specific findings on the likely overall fatality rate, which are considered more accurate than any of the estimations that have been done previously. So today, Professor Spagat is going to be talking about some new research that he has done. He has looked at the demographics of fatalities across a range of situations of armed conflict. And by analyzing these, has found particular trends which group clusters of demographics in reliable, consistent patterns, which can be used to identify different forms of violence. And he's going to explain a little bit about how he did that and what that information shows. Now, of course, one of the questions on everybody's lips at the moment is about the situation in Gaza, the genocide or not genocide, depending on who you're listening to. And this presentation will touch on that topic, but I'd like to reiterate, of course, that genocide is a crime which contains both a mental element and a physical element. And what Professor Spagat will be presenting is evidence of a physical element. We're not going to touch on the topic of mental intent or legality, but we're simply going to be presenting the information that Professor Spagat has found based on analyzing information about the demographics of deaths in Gaza since 2023 compared to other forms of violence, genocide, and armed conflict elsewhere. And one of the things which obviously for us at Every Casualty is very important is the fact that Professor Spagat's research has been possible only because of the existence of very detailed casualty records and surveys from a wide range of contexts. And it's only through this granular information that it's possible to look in detail at the similarities and differences of different types of situations of armed violence. And this is one of the reasons why actual documentation of genuine individuals rather than estimates or other forms of purely statistical development of figures around armed conflict deaths is so important. We have opened the chat on the side, and we welcome you to add questions throughout. We'll address the questions at the end so that Professor Spagat can give his presentation. We'll try not to interrupt him unless something very urgent comes up, but please do add your questions as you think of them, because sometimes you get to the end of the presentation and you've forgotten what you were asking, what you wanted to ask about earlier. There is, of course, a zero tolerance policy related to any kind of offensive, discriminatory, or disrespectful comments. I'm sure Professor Spagat welcomes robust questioning and will be happy to explain and defend his research, but anybody posting inappropriate content will be removed and blocked immediately. I will hand over to Professor Spagat in just a moment to begin his presentation. And before that, I would just like to ask everyone to take a few moments with me in silence to remember the fact that we're not talking here purely about numbers or figures or statistics, but about human lives which have ended in terrible circumstances. And it's very easy for these discussions to lose sight of that fact. So if you would just take a few moments, and I will pass to Mike in just a second. Mike, would you like to begin your presentation?
So let's start with the core idea. In many analyses of armed conflict, we focus on the question of how many people have died. And I've done a lot of this myself, including in the Gaza survey that Rachel mentioned in her introduction. But we can get a lot more insight, in particular, into the nature of violence by digging a little bit deeper and asking who has died. And I'm going to suggest that different types of violence leave behind distinctive demographic fingerprints. And then I'm going to apply that idea specifically to the Gaza conflict post October 7. Okay, so we're at the fingerprint idea. So here, what I'm suggesting is that we can characterize any conflict by the fraction of deaths falling within age ranges of 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and then on up with a catch-all of 50 plus at the top, and separate categories for males and females. So that's actually 22 different age/sex categories. And when we fill in the fraction of all deaths falling in within each of these 22 different categories, that's what I'm going to call a demographic fingerprint for the conflict. I'm then going to group conflicts together into clusters where within a cluster, each conflict is going to have a similar demographic fingerprint. But if we compare conflicts within two different clusters or between two different clusters, then they're going to have very different demographic fingerprints. And the idea here is that membership in a group of, call them notorious cases, should be seen as incriminating evidence. But evidence like a fingerprint found at a crime scene is not dispositive, is that it doesn't on its own establish legal responsibility or intent, but it is kind of a piece of information that pushes in that direction. Here is a list of the conflicts with the dates covered that we're going to have here. You'll notice if you look at the right-hand column that there are actually no fewer than 6 which are different parts of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, if we like, we could say maybe that there are 15 instead of 20 here, but all the others are kind of self-standing conflicts or events within a particular conflict. And I don't have time to go into any kind of detail on each one of these, but if you want to ask about any particular one, I suggest we do it in the Q&A. And if you've got a really strong interest in understanding the data in detail, I would suggest that you get in touch with me and we could do that. Okay, now I've mentioned that we're going to be grouping conflicts so that within a group, everything will be similar to each other. But what does similarity mean? So I just want to give you an intuitive idea of what this looks like in a simplified example here. So imagine we've got two conflicts, and I said a minute ago that I'm actually working with 22 different age-sex categories. But here, just to show you how this works, we've got just 5, and we don't distinguish between sexes. But so we've got the categories, conflict A and conflict B, and then for each one, we have the fraction of all deaths that fall within each particular category. Okay, and you see these are different for the different made-up conflicts that we're looking at here. So then we take a difference of the fractions, each pair of fractions for one of the conflicts. So the first number in this table on the right is going to be the difference between 0.05 and 0.22. So it's 0.17. So we take all of these differences, and then we have, you can think of it as a little machine that looks at all of those differences. For this analysis, there'll be 22 of them for each pair of cases. And from that, it produces a number between 0 and 1, where 0 would mean that the two distributions are completely identical, and 1 means that they're completely different. Okay, so it always comes out between 0 and 1. If I had another set of differences besides these, where each one was a little bit larger than the differences you're looking at, so if I had like 0.18, 0.11, 0.26, 0.09, 0.07, and then I compress it through the machine, I would get a larger number because that would be more different. And then the next step in the analysis is to identify groups that are going to have the property that distances within groups between conflicts are small, but differences between groups are large. Okay, so these groups are then going to be the clusters. So I perform that analysis, and I can talk in as much detail as you like about how that works in the Q&A or in separate conversations later if you like. But here I'm showing you what the results look like. So we wind up with 3 different patterns, or in other words, clusters. And I've just affixed names to these clusters. These are names that I came up with after I had sort of looked at their properties. So the first cluster I call combatant skewed, and this has a pattern that young adult males dominate among the dead, which is not to say that all deaths are young adult males. For all of these patterns, you always have all age ranges and both sexes represented throughout, unfortunately. Okay, but the young adult males predominate here. This pattern is at least consistent with armed groups fighting with each other, which is not to say that all of the deaths within the conflicts in this cluster are generated by armed groups fighting with each other, but probably at least some substantial proportion of them are. You'll see a full list later, but examples are Colombia, Northern Ireland, and the early stages, like the first year of the Iraq War, 2003 to 2004. The second pattern or cluster I've dubbed male targeted. And in this pattern, we have males across a wide range of ages are killed in large numbers. Okay, so that's what distinguishes it from the combatant skewed, is that it's not mostly just the young adult males, but for a lot of different ages, you've got large numbers of males killed. As I said before, that doesn't mean that females aren't killed, but you have predominantly males killed and lots of ages are represented. So this is consistent with systematic elimination of males regardless of combatant status. And examples here include Bosnia, especially the Srebrenica genocide, and also the recent conflict in Tigray. The third pattern I call indiscriminate. So with this pattern, we have deaths spread widely across many age ranges and both sexes, which means in particular that women, children, and elderly are present among the dead in substantial numbers. And examples here include the Rwandan genocide and Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. And it's worth emphasizing that these patterns emerge from complete age-sex distributions. That is, age categories 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, etc. Not just summary statistics such as the percent of males among the dead. So let's have a look now at these three patterns or clusters and make some qualitative observations. So the first thing that no doubt your eyes have immediately been drawn to is a little bit of a red herring, which is these terrific spikes up here at the top. What you have to bear in mind is that the top age category is a catch-all that includes a much wider range of ages than all of the other age categories. So this is 50 all the way up to the oldest person who is killed. So it's inevitable that there's going to be a big spike at the 50 plus. So that in and of itself is not particularly noteworthy, although it is worth looking at the differences between the three patterns, which I'm going to return to in a minute. Let's first focus on the indiscriminate pattern, which is the red curve. Okay, and you see we've got the red curve going through a bunch of dots. Okay, so those dots are precisely the fraction within that age sex category among all of the dead. What we see here, first of all, is that for the indiscriminate category, there are large numbers of children of both sexes. Okay, I'm waving my mouse over females here. I'm now waving my mouse over males here. And you see that they're very far away from the patterns in the other clusters. And then you'll also see that females are always at their highest for the indiscriminate cluster. A couple times we get another cluster that's close, such as here, where they're almost touching. But generally speaking, a lot more females in the red than in the other clusters. And then we've got substantial numbers in all age ranges. Probably the second most striking aspect of this picture is the huge gold spike out here. So this is the combatant skewed cluster. And what we're seeing here is that young adult males are accounting for a very large fraction of the total deaths for the conflicts within this cluster. So we're really very far to the left here for the 15 to 19 category, and it's worth mentioning that includes some children. For 20 to 24, 25 to 29, we're still quite far out, even for 30 to 34, although the male targeted cluster exceeds the combatant skewed cluster for the 30 to 34 age range. And then if we move over to the females, we see, we've already observed that they're well to the left of the indiscriminate cluster, but the combatant skewed cluster also has fairly large numbers of young adult females in it. Finally, we have the male targeted cluster, and I would say the most salient feature here is lots of males for a wide range of ages, including a terrific spike at 50 plus. So I kind of downplayed the 50 plus category before, but it's worth comparing here with the other clusters, and we see we're really far to the left for male targeted at the 50 plus range. Okay, so this is just to reinforce quickly. So indiscriminate deaths spread across many ages and sexes. It broadly resembles the demographics of the population from which it's drawn. Male targeted, we've got males of a wide range of adult ages, die at elevated rates, and combatants skewed this sharp young male spike. Okay, very distinctive patterns visually. So how does Gaza post October 7 fit into this? The answer is that it clusters with Rwanda, Cambodia, and there's a fourth member of the indiscriminate cluster, which probably many of you haven't heard of, but this is called the El Mazote massacre, which is an event that took place during the civil war in El Salvador, in which every single person in a village was systematically killed. So what we have here really is just a demographic portrait of the village pre-massacre. These are the cases in the male targeted cluster, and you notice Srebrenica falls in there, as does Bosnia more generally. And this is the combatant skewed cluster. It turns out that actually all of the other Israel-Palestine cases wind up in there. So I want to emphasize the indiscriminate cluster is very different from the other two. It's not really a close call. Gaza sits within it, okay? But let's actually have a look. So this picture here is looking at precisely the four cases in the indiscriminate cluster. And you see, although they're similar to each other, there is some substantial variation. I would say my first observation is, so the red one is Gaza, this blue one is Rwanda. So I would say that these track reasonably well for both the males and females, except that clearly Gaza is more predominantly male. Okay, so on the male side, red is to the left of blue, and on the female side, red, well, is also to the left of blue, but that has different meaning. Again, we have an interesting observation in gold. Now, this one represents Cambodia. So Cambodia has really tremendous numbers of boys killed. El Mazote also has tremendous numbers of boys killed, but girls are a little bit different. So El Mazote also has very large numbers of girls killed, but this is somewhat attenuated for Cambodia. So again, this is just to reinforce. So Gaza tracking reasonably well with Rwanda, except for the fact that Gaza is more oriented toward young adult males, and Cambodia has huge numbers of child deaths, especially boys, and El Mazote, strong concentration of both boys and girls. Okay, so to kind of sum up, in demographic space, Gaza is uncomfortably close to cases of mass atrocity, even genocide, albeit with a relative bulge in the young adult male category. Common objections to defend the conduct of the IDF and Israel in this war. One is the urban warfare tunnel argument, that is, operational complexity makes discrimination difficult. I just like to pause to mention here that this argument essentially concedes that killing has been indiscriminate, but it tries to excuse this based on difficult circumstances. Objection 2, Gaza has an excess of male over female deaths aged 15 to 39, and this is proof that the IDF was targeting combatants. But what we find is that the young male excess in Gaza is small compared to the other two patterns or clusters where this excess of young males over females is dramatic. So I want to draw that out with this picture here. So this picture is completely identical to the very first picture that I showed you. It shows the three clusters or patterns using exactly the same color scheme as before, but it just adds in Gaza specifically. So Gaza is in black. And what you can see is that Gaza is, in fact, like the other two clusters, and in particular, it has nowhere near the young male adult bulge that the combatant skewed cluster has. It's actually quite near to the indiscriminate cluster, albeit with somewhat more males than is the average within that cluster. Third objection, Gaza has a very young population, so it's not surprising that many children were killed. Again, I would note that this argument also essentially concedes indiscriminate killing, because it's basically saying that children are killed just because they happen to be around in large numbers. But nevertheless, I tried to address this by redoing the analysis, but taking into account the population age structure. So I did a parallel analysis that is driven by death rates per 100,000 rather than by the raw fraction. So for each of these age sex categories, I've got a figure for the percent of the population that is within that category, and then we take that into account when coming up with the clusters. Okay, I have to exclude El Mazote from this analysis because 100% of the people are killed in every single one of those age sex categories. And the result, we find that there is some migration between the male targeted and combatant skewed clusters. Some conflicts move from one to the other, but the indiscriminate cluster holds up. So we still end up with Gaza clustering with Rwanda and Cambodia here. So taking the population into account doesn't really change the fundamental result that I'm presenting here. Okay, I'm getting close to finishing. So just want to highlight a couple limitations. So data quality does vary. We've got some figures from surveys, some from documented records. Sometimes I think the documented records are pretty large undercounts. I'd single out Tigray as only, it's a great effort that was made that was actually supported specifically by every casualty counts, but it was just hard to get information on all of the deaths coming out of Tigray during this period. So sometimes we've got undercounts, but undercounting per se is not really a problem. The problem would arise if undercounting is associated with demographic bias. So the point is, as long as we've got broadly accurate figures for the fractions falling into the different age sex categories, we don't really have a problem. There is the issue of the age truncation at the top. Because of Rwanda and Cambodia, I can't work with detailed age categories above 50. For most of the conflicts, I do have detailed age categories up there. But if I get rid of Rwanda and Cambodia, this analysis can't really proceed the way it has today. More cases would be absolutely welcome. So if you ask, why did I pick those cases? Those are all of the cases I've been able to get data for so far. I think I can probably get data for a few more. And if anyone out there can help with that, I would hugely appreciate it. So conclusion, age-sec patterns of deaths in Gaza places in the same demographic cluster as Rwanda, Cambodia, and the El Mazote massacre, cases universally recognized as mass atrocities or genocides. what I've done is a quantitative comparative analysis. So it's a demographic fingerprint pointing toward indiscriminate killing that's robust across two independent analyses. That is, one's taking into account population structure, and another not taking into account population structure. What this is not is a legal determination of genocide. We need more analysis, and we need analysis of a different kind, really, to get us all the way there. But I think this is evidence that is troubling and points in that direction. Okay, that's it. Open to questions.
Thank you, Mike. That was very informative. And I think while people are thinking about what you've said and preparing their questions, there are a couple of things that I wanted to ask about. To me, one of the things that I found surprising was the information for Northern Ireland, also perhaps also for Colombia and the previous conflicts in Gaza and Israel. I was expecting, just from my general knowledge of those conflicts, for those to be skewed more towards an indiscriminate killing pattern. But clearly from what you've said, they were not. And maybe taking, for example, the previous rounds of conflict in Gaza and Israel, did you see that they were very different from what has happened since 2023? Because I know, obviously, in many occasions in the past, there's been allegations that that civilians were being targeted indiscriminately. You've said that the situation since 2023 is very different, but how different is that from previous years in that context?
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that question. So maybe I need to rethink the names that I've attached to the clusters. By naming one of the clusters indiscriminate, I realized, listening to your question, that it seems to imply that in some sense the other conflicts are kind of okay. Although discrimination, first thing I say is discrimination can be a bad thing. So, for example, just look at the Srebrenica genocide. So, so specifically targeting males, that, without, I mean, I'm sure there were combatants among those who were killed, but without really any kind of determination of civilian combatant strategy, distinction. But to get back to the beginning of your question, Gaza after October 7 really is very different from earlier stages in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and from all these other cases that ended up in the different clusters. One thing that I found very surprising, actually, when I looked at it, when I looked at the West Bank, is just how many males, and in particular young adult males, it's really pretty heavy on young adult males. And that's not to say I don't want to for a minute suggest that means that they were combatants or something like that, but demographically it's really extremely different from Gaza. And same thing, Colombia, Northern Ireland, they're very different. You notice I never used the word civilian. I used it a minute ago in answer to your question, but I don't have civilian on the slide because I don't have any way to directly distinguish between civilians and combatants here. We know ages and we know sexes. And that's correlated with civilian combatant status, but it's not at all the same thing.
Thank you. I'm just going to go to a couple of the questions that have come up here. First, just a comment from James Ron saying there is data available in Mexico from the government, which would be great. If you have particular links or sources you can point us to directly, James, that would be helpful. I'm aware of many sources in Mexico relating to different topics, but I haven't yet found one that was really comprehensive, so I'd love to see that if you have it. Then James is adding, Mike, any chance you could easily present the bivariate mortality data for Gaza? And we also have a question from Nick asking, can you say a little more about how you generated the normalized proportions on your x-axis? Now, I was the one who actually asked Mike to dumb down some of the statistical work in the presentation because as a layperson, I found it confusing, but there are clearly some people here who would like that detail. I don't know if you want to go into that now or whether you feel that's something better to follow up directly and share your graphs and your data. Up to you.
Okay. For James, definitely we'll communicate about data. I'm not quite sure what bivariate analysis you want, so maybe you could try to clarify that in the chat. The second question, I think, is about when I normalize for populations. Okay, so for that, what we start with is a population pyramid, so that we've got the number of people in each of these age sex categories in the population. We then calculate number of deaths per 100,000 of population again, and then we put that into all of the 22 categories there, and then basically we convert those all into fractions of we basically add them all up and then divide the raw number in each of those age sex categories by the total. And then we've got a bunch of fractions adding up to one, just as we did before, and the analysis proceeds from there. Hopefully that was the question you were asking.
I'll leave it to Nick to respond in the comments if that was the question he was asking, or to elaborate on that further. And I can see James is asking for just the age, sex, mortality breakdown for post-October 7 Gaza. I know you've presented this extensively elsewhere.
Okay, so it was actually shown in one of the slides. So it's given by this black line here. Okay, so we've got, of course, I mean, I could give the exact numbers rather than asking you to estimate them off of the graph, but you could sort of eyeball them off of the graph. You can see the fraction in each one of the categories by reading off of this black line. But I mean, I can provide those exact numbers, although I don't have them handy, and I wouldn't try to grope around for them here live. But if you follow up with me, I can show that all to you.
Great, thank you, Mike. Maybe if anyone is interested in receiving copies of the actual data that Mike's used, if you drop an email to me or directly to Mike after the webinar, we can put you in touch and he can share that information. A couple of other questions and comments. One from Martin saying it's very useful, but he'd point out that indiscriminate killing doesn't equal genocide. Genocide can be targeted a la Srebrenica. Likewise, genocide can be committed in the context of war, as in Gaza. So an element of young male targeting doesn't disprove genocide. In fact, that was one of the points that I was thinking about as well as I looked at your graph with the male skewed cluster, and thinking about, obviously, as genocide can include an element of trying to prevent births in a group, evidently eliminating one sex entirely, as we've seen in some contexts like Srebrenica, where the men of reproductive age are killed and the women are forcibly impregnated, is also a means of committing genocide. So I think nobody's saying that that would not be also a form of, potentially a form of genocide. Again, always paying attention to the legal element there. There's a question as well from someone asking, would you agree that comparing conflict data from different countries and years can be a useful tool for governments to evaluate the success of past diplomatic, peacekeeping, military interventions and plan new ones? Any advice for diplomats? I should have put the word success maybe in quotation marks, because I think if you're comparing large amounts of fatality data, by definition, it hasn't been a success. But do you have a comment on that, Mike?
So I absolutely think that this kind of analysis is potentially useful, policy relevant. Although I haven't tried to focus really on that aspect so much. And this particular approach, I think, is really very new to look at the age sex patterns in detail like this. So I'm just kind of starting to think this through. But I do think that with care, if, for example, if we look in detail at these 20 cases, okay, so we kind of know what the demographic fingerprint looks like. Now, if we can combine that with deep knowledge of these individual conflicts, of which, like, some of these I have like only passing knowledge, some I have maybe semi-deep. I'd like to kind of interact with people who are real experts on each one of these conflicts, and see how they react. I think a lot of insight will come out of it. I think some people might be surprised by how some of these conflicts sit within the overall picture. Rachel was surprised by some of this. As I say, I was surprised by actually West Bank. I already mentioned that. There are other measures that you have to look at. I would never suggest that we should only start focusing on this. At the beginning, I said it's customary to focus on how many people are killed, and I didn't mean to say we should stop doing that. We should also do that. One way in which Gaza after October 7th stands out is that the sheer rate of killing is really high. It's there are a few cases where people are killed at such a rate. Okay, but to go back to the question, I think that there can be advice for diplomats here, but I'm not really prepared off the top of my head to offer it. I'm just sort of getting started here, and it'd be interesting to interact with some diplomats, discuss this, and see how they might react to it.
Maybe baseline advice would be threatening to kill an entire civilization and wipe it out from the earth forever is never a good look. There's a question
we never would have known without this presentation. Yeah.
Ian has added a comment about the missing. And he says, this is a question for Mike. What happens to those who are not recorded dead but are dead? For example, do we have any idea of their place in the data, such as people under the rubble in Gaza? Now, I know that's something that was addressed in the mortality survey recently. Maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah. So in some of these cases, I would say that is well taken care of, and in other cases, not so much. So, for example, Kosovo Memory Book, which is where I get the Kosovo data from, they actually distinguish between, they've got two categories. I can't remember. I think they call them something like murdered and disappeared, or something like that. But if you ask them, they'll clarify. Like disappeared means 100% dead, but a body has not been recovered. Now they've been doing this for so long with such care that there's not much chance that there are people that are somehow like in Brussels now or something that are thought to have been killed and actually weren't killed. I think they've really sorted that out. In Gaza, it's partly sorted out. As you may have guessed, the data here is from the Gaza Ministry of Health. So there's a process where relatives can report somebody.
I am going to take the opportunity, just as we only have a few minutes left, because I know this is a particular recurring issue around what everyone has heard of, this figure, this notorious figure that gets cited: about 90% of victims of armed conflict are civilians, which is obviously very shocking and mobilizes attention to the situation of armed conflict and its impact on civilians, but also is notoriously not quite accurate, and in your view does more harm than good, being used to raise awareness because it is used as something to hide behind. Would you like to explain a bit more about that?
Sure. So this is it's a false figure that is rooted in a misunderstanding that it was originally some report that was put out by Uppsala University that said something along the lines of 90% of the victims of armed conflict are civilians. But if you look at the report, that included refugees.
Unfortunately, Mike appears to have frozen again. Let's give him a second. I can actually answer this for him because we had this conversation yesterday. So I'll answer my own question if anyone's interested. What he was going to say is what the report was referring to was the fact that 90% of victims, in a widely defined meaning of the term, are civilians. So the impact of conflict is predominantly felt by civilians rather than military personnel, which is clearly unsurprising given that military personnel are a small fraction of any given population. If Ian is still active in the chat, I know there are some figures which are very similar relating to the percentage of civilians killed by explosive weapons in populated areas. And I think that those two pieces of information were somehow blurred along the years between the number of people killed by explosive weapons in populated areas, where once again civilians are massively overrepresented, and the previous report that Mike was speaking about, to give this impression that in modern warfare 90% of the people killed are civilians. That's not true. And the reason why that's a dangerous thank you, Ian, I'll come back to that. The reason why that's a dangerous myth to propagate is the fact that it can then be used by militaries to say, well, we've only killed 50% of civilians, or rather 50% of the people we've killed are civilians, therefore we're doing a good job because we're not killing 90%, when in fact, as Mike's data just showed, in a combat which is between defined military parties, between defined groups, there is a very clear focus on a quite tight age range, predominantly male, but also some female of fighting age, rather than this widespread civilian death rate. So Ian mentioned 90% of those killed and injured when explosive weapons are used in population areas are civilians. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, everybody, for your participation today and for bearing with us with some technical issues. It wouldn't be a webinar without some technical issues, so that's to be expected. Thank thank you for your thoughts, your suggestions, your comments, and we hope to see you again sometime when we do another one of these. If you have any questions in the meantime, please do feel free to send them in. I know Mike is very happy to share his data. He's just come back, but I'm just wrapping up, Mike. Sorry, we lost you. I was just saying that you'd be happy to share your data and your figures and your many complicated graphs, but please do follow up with questions, and anyone who has information about particular conflicts, particularly those which were not represented in Mike's data set. I know there's someone here from a Biafra genocide organization. We'd love to find out more if you have data that you can share. Otherwise, that's all for now from us. Thank you very much. We will see you next time.
Thank you for coming.